Everyone has an opinion, so here's mine. Every single day I get on one of these apps and I continue to hear about women saying men are withdrawing from society, from being present and active participants in society. Now, do men still show up and do their jobs, infrastructure, working at the car dealership, the car repairman, and all that? Yes. But when it comes to social functions, when it comes to nightlife, when it comes to clubs, restaurants, bars, grills, things of that nature, men have checked out. And a lot of women are wondering why. It's obvious knowledge that women have all for years been asking men to leave them alone. They didn't want to be talked to, they didn't want to be bothered, they deemed it as harassment. Then the next talking point that was used to try to describe this is toxic masculinity. Well, you said all of us were toxic masculinity representatives and you didn't want to be a part of that. Okay, fine. Well, for one thing, you told us that anything that we do, anything that we say is either zesty or toxic masculinity. There was no in between, no middle ground. It's either you're zesty when you try to, argue with women, when you try to challenge women, when you try to tell women that they're wrong, when you offer correction towards women, they view you as zesty. Only a zesty man would try to correct a woman when she's wrong. Only a zesty woman would rebut or have a retort for an inaccurate response by a woman. Only a zesty man would do that. And then, of course, you have toxic masculinity. Men who, just exist are considered as toxic masculinity. You woke up this morning, toxic masculinity. You took a breath, toxic masculinity. You went to work today, toxic masculinity.
Society is standing at a crossroads that most people never expected to reach this quickly. The promises that were made to entire generations about stability, fairness, and opportunity have quietly expired, yet no one has stepped forward to announce that the contract is over. People feel it in their daily lives before they ever articulate it out loud, in grocery stores, in rent payments, in shrinking options, and growing anxiety. This video is not about outrage for its own sake. It is about tracing how we arrived here and why one group in particular has quietly exited the stage. Stay with me to the very end because what is happening right now is not temporary, and it is not going to reverse itself the way many people still believe it will. If you find value in honest conversations like this, take a second to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all so you never miss a single Angry Guy video the moment it is released. These discussions matter, and the algorithm only amplifies what people actively support. I also want to remind you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. The Academy is designed to help you protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth by learning how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly in an unstable world. If you are serious about building resilience and long-term security, go check it out now through the link below. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support for the work that goes into them, you can always buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to keep the lights on and the content coming. Now let us talk about the world as it actually exists, not the version people were promised or the one they still repeat out of habit. Society is in visible decline, and this is not a dramatic statement meant to provoke clicks. It is an observation grounded in everyday experience. Millions of people cannot afford food without compromise. Rent has consumed income to the point where saving is no longer realistic. The middle class, which once acted as the stabilizing backbone of society, has thinned into a fragile illusion maintained by debt and denial. And perhaps most unsettling of all is the realization that no cavalry is coming to fix it. Governments are gridlocked, institutions are reactive instead of proactive, and cultural narratives are frozen in a past that no longer matches reality. People still speak as if solutions are just one election away or one movement away. But daily life tells a different story. When systems fail slowly, people adapt quietly until adaptation becomes exhaustion. That is where we are now. One of the hardest truths for many to accept is that men are not coming to save society from this collapse. For decades, men were told directly and indirectly that their presence was unwanted, that their instincts were suspect, and that their contributions were conditional at best. When people are told repeatedly that they are a problem, they eventually stop offering solutions. This was not a sudden rebellion or a dramatic announcement. It was a long, silent withdrawal. Men did not disappear overnight. They listened, they adjusted, they absorbed the message that society did not need them unless they were providing something under strict terms. Over time, many decided that the cost of participation outweighed the benefits. What we are seeing now is not apathy, it is the outcome of sustained social pressure. For years, men were told to step aside, to stay quiet, to interrogate their own nature as if it were inherently defective. Masculinity itself was reframed as something dangerous rather than something to be guided and refined. Entire generations of boys grew up being taught what not to be, with very little guidance on what they were allowed to become. The result was predictable, even if it was ignored. When feminism moved from advocating equality to positioning men as a collective liability, it altered the social contract. The conversation stopped being about cooperation and became about correction and punishment. Men were expected to participate in a system that viewed them with suspicion while still providing stability, protection, and resources. That imbalance could not sustain itself indefinitely. Over time, cultural enforcement replaced dialogue. Everyday behaviors were scrutinized and reframed as moral offenses. The creation of terms designed to shame and police men's normal actions did not build understanding. It built resentment and caution. Men learned that any interaction carried risk, that intent no longer mattered as much as perception, and that perception could be weaponized. Legal systems increasingly reflected this imbalance. Divorce courts, family courts, civil disputes, and criminal accusations often placed men in defensive positions where the burden of proof felt asymmetrical. Regardless of intent or outcome, the process itself became a deterrent. Many men learned through observation rather than personal experience, watching friends, coworkers, and family members lose stability, resources, and years of their lives navigating systems that presumed fault rather than fairness. Public spaces became hostile environments rather than neutral ones. Men were told not to approach, not to speak, not to look, not to exist incorrectly. At the same time, social media turned everyday interactions into potential public trials. A moment taken out of context could be recorded, edited, and broadcast without recourse, and reputation, once destroyed, could not be rebuilt with truth alone. Dating, which was once a mutual process of discovery, shifted into a transactional performance with uneven expectations. Men were expected to invest time, money, and emotional labor up front while being told that interest, intimacy, or even courtesy was not guaranteed. Over time, many recognized the pattern and opted out rather than continue participating in a system that offered diminishing returns. Online spaces amplified these dynamics. Private groups and applications emerged where men were discussed, evaluated, and sometimes condemned without accountability or verification. Social standing became fragile, subject to rumor and interpretation rather than direct experience. Men learned that their names, careers, and relationships could be affected by narratives they had no ability to confront. All of this occurred alongside a cultural narrative that framed women as perpetual victims and men as default aggressors. Complexity disappeared. Individual behavior was replaced by group identity. Nuance was sacrificed for slogans. In this environment, men were not encouraged to improve, they were encouraged to disappear. And disappear they did, not in a physical sense, but in engagement. Men stopped dating, they stopped initiating, they stopped overextending themselves for validation that never arrived. They stopped explaining themselves to systems that were not listening. They stopped playing a game where the rules changed without warning and the penalties were permanent. Walking away did not mean despair. In many cases, it meant clarity. Men discovered that being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. Without constant judgment or obligation, many found peace in simplicity. They reoriented their lives around stability rather than approval. They learned to enjoy their own company, their hobbies, their work, and their routines without external validation. Minimalism came naturally. Men reduced their lives to what mattered and eliminated what did not. Without the pressure to perform or impress, expenses dropped and stress followed. Simple comforts replaced constant striving. Rest replaced anxiety. Time became their own again. In this process, many men rediscovered themselves. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. They remembered who they were before they were told they were defective. They built lives that were quieter but more grounded. They invested in skills, health, and personal interests rather than chasing unstable approval. This was not a retreat born of bitterness, but a recalibration born of experience. Historically, men stood between reality and comfort, absorbing risk so others could feel secure. They worked longer hours, took greater physical risks, and carried responsibility with the understanding that their efforts were valued. When that understanding dissolved, so did the incentive to continue playing that role. Now, as economic pressure increases, some are noticing the absence. Social media is filled with expressions of frustration and confusion about how difficult survival has become. The same structures that once relied on male participation now struggle without it. Demands for re-engagement grow louder as resources shrink. But men are not returning to a system that has not changed. They are not resuming roles that cost them peace, stability, and dignity. They are not ignoring the patterns they spent years observing. Pattern recognition has replaced persuasion. Observable reality has replaced promises. Men no longer give attention, time, or money reflexively. They invest deliberately or not at all. They keep their resources, protect their energy, and prioritize their own well being. This is not hostility, it is self preservation. The consequences of this shift are still unfolding. As traditional dynamics dissolve, new realities emerge. Some thrive, some struggle, and some demand reversals that are no longer possible. Systems built on assumptions fail when those assumptions expire. What we are witnessing is not a temporary phase, but a long-term adjustment. Men did not vanish, they adapted. They are present, productive, and content in ways that do not align with outdated expectations. They are living differently, not worse. As society continues to strain under economic and cultural pressure, the absence of male participation in certain areas will become more visible. The question is not whether men will return, but whether the structures they left behind will adapt to reality. This conversation is uncomfortable because it challenges narratives that have gone unquestioned for decades. But discomfort is often the first sign of truth pushing through habit. Ignoring it will not reverse the trend. Understanding it might at least clarify what comes next. And this is only the beginning of the discussion. What comes next is where most people lose the thread because they are still operating under the assumption that this shift can be reversed with messaging, incentives, or guilt. That assumption misunderstands what actually happened. Men did not leave because they were angry for a moment or disappointed by a few experiences. They left because they observed consistent patterns over long periods of time and adjusted accordingly. When behavior repeats itself across environments, demographics, and platforms, it stops being anecdotal and starts being instructional. Men did not need a manifesto or a movement to walk away. They simply compared effort to outcome and chose rational self interest. One of the biggest mistakes made by modern society is believing that men are motivated primarily by status or approval. Those things matter early in life, especially when identity is still forming, but over time, men gravitate towards stability, peace, and control over their own time. When participation in social systems became synonymous with instability, scrutiny, and constant negotiation, many men opted out quietly. There was no announcement because there did not need to be one. The absence itself became the message. This withdrawal did not happen in a vacuum. It coincided with a period where economic pressure intensified. Wages stagnated while costs rose. The expectation that men should continue to provide at levels that were realistic decades ago became increasingly detached from reality. When effort no longer translated into security, motivation eroded. Men saw that working harder did not guarantee stability, and sacrificing more did not lead to appreciation. In that environment, preservation becomes logical. At the same time, cultural narratives continue to demand more from men while offering less in return. Men were told to be emotionally available, but also emotionally restrained. They were told to be providers, but also to step aside. They were told to be accountable for everything while having authority over nothing. These contradictions created an impossible standard that no amount of effort could satisfy. Over time, many men recognized that the standard itself was the problem. The dating landscape reflected this imbalance clearly. Men were expected to initiate, plan, pay, and perform while being reminded that they were not entitled to interest, respect, or even basic courtesy. Meanwhile, standards and expectations continued to rise without corresponding effort. What was once framed as empowerment slowly drifted into entitlement. Men noticed the shift and adjusted their participation accordingly. Technology accelerated this realization. Social media removed filters and exposed attitudes that were once hidden behind politeness. Men saw candid discussions about expectations, preferences, and perceptions that contradicted public messaging. They noticed the gap between words and actions. Once that gap becomes visible, it cannot be unseen. Trust erodes when messaging and behavior diverge consistently. Men also observed how accountability was applied unevenly. Mistakes made by men were treated as reflections of character, while similar behavior by others was contextualized or excused. Over time, this imbalance taught men that the safest position was distance. You cannot lose a game you refuse to play. You cannot be judged in spaces you do not enter. As men stepped back, they discovered something unexpected. Life became quieter, stress decreased, finances stabilized. Without the pressure to meet shifting expectations, men were able to plan long term. They invested in skills rather than appearances. They focused on health, routines, and personal growth without external interference. The absence of chaos revealed how much of their previous stress had been situational rather than inherent. This is where the narrative often collapses because critics assume that men walking away must be unhappy or bitter. The opposite is often true. Many men report increased satisfaction once they reclaim control over their time and resources. They sleep better, they worry less, they feel grounded. These are not the outcomes of withdrawal driven by despair. They are the outcomes of alignment. And men began building lives that were resilient rather than performative. Instead of chasing validation, they pursued competence. Instead of social approval, they prioritized inner stability. Instead of constant engagement, they chose selective interaction. This shift did not require permission or recognition, it simply required honesty. Meanwhile, society continued operating under outdated assumptions. Systems that relied on male participation did not adapt quickly enough. As fewer men volunteered their time, energy, and resources, gaps began to appear. Some attempted to fill those gaps with rhetoric, others with pressure. Neither approach addressed the root cause. The economic impact of the shift is still unfolding. When men stop overextending themselves financially in dating and relationships, disposable income patterns change. Entire industries built around romantic aspiration feel the contraction. Hospitality, entertainment, and lifestyle markets adjust slowly, often misreading the cause as temporary rather than structural. Social dynamics change as well. Fewer men competing for attention alters negotiation dynamics. Expectations that once relied on abundance face resistance when scarcity emerges. This creates frustration, confusion, and denial among those who assumed the old model would persist indefinitely. It is important to understand that men did not walk away from responsibility. They walked away from exploitation. They still work, they still contribute, they still build, they simply do so on their own terms rather than under constant scrutiny. Responsibility without agency is servitude, and men recognize the distinction. Another overlooked factor is how men communicate among themselves. While public discourse often frames men as isolated, many share insights quietly through observation and experience. Advice is exchanged without slogans or movements. Lessons are learned through outcomes rather than ideology. This organic knowledge transfer reinforces the decision to disengage from unstable systems. Men also learn to trust their experiences over narratives. When repeated experiences contradict official messaging, credibility collapses. Men adjusted by prioritizing what they could verify. Observable reality replaced abstract claims. This shift toward empiricism made reversal unlikely. As this trend continues, the cultural response becomes more fragmented. Some acknowledge the shift and adapt, others deny it and escalate demands. A smaller group attempts introspection, recognizing that sustainable cooperation requires mutual respect. Which response dominates will shape the next phase of social evolution. What is clear is that men are not returning to roles that cost them peace without offering stability. They are not resuming patterns that punished effort and rewarded compliance. They are not ignoring lessons learned at great personal cost. The decision to walk away was not impulsive, and it will not be undone easily. This creates a paradox for modern society. Many systems were built on the assumption of male overcontribution. When that assumption fails, those systems strain. Adaptation becomes necessary, but adaptation requires acknowledging reality rather than repeating slogans. Men who have stepped back are not invisible. They are visible in different ways. They are present in their work, in their routines, in their quiet achievements. They are no longer advertising themselves for approval. They are no longer negotiating their worth. They are simply living. The silence that surrounds this shift is intentional. Men learned that explaining themselves rarely led to understanding. Actions communicate more clearly than arguments. Withdrawal became the most honest form of feedback available. As economic pressure increases, this silence grows louder. When fewer men step forward to absorb risk or provide support, the consequences become harder to ignore. Demands for participation increase just as incentives decrease. This mismatch accelerates disengagement rather than reversing it. Some will argue that this is unhealthy or unsustainable. That argument assumes that the previous arrangement was healthy and sustainable, which evidence increasingly contradicts. Stability built on imbalance is temporary by definition. Correction is inevitable. Men did not engineer this outcome, they responded to it. They adjusted to incentives as they were presented. When participation became a liability rather than an asset, withdrawal became rational. Blaming men for responding logically to conditions avoids examining the conditions themselves. The future will belong to those who adapt honestly. Cooperation is still possible, but it cannot be coerced. Respect cannot be demanded while behavior undermines it. Balance cannot be restored by ignoring reality. These are lessons learned the hard way. For men walking away, the goal is not isolation, but autonomy. It is the ability to choose engagement rather than being compelled into it. It is the freedom to build a life that reflects values rather than expectations. That freedom is difficult to surrender once experienced. As more men reach this conclusion independently, the trend reinforces itself. Younger men observe older ones opting out and learn preemptively. Lessons that once required personal loss are now learned vicariously. This accelerates the shift. Society often underestimates how quickly norms can change once tipping points are reached. What seemed unthinkable a decade ago becomes normal within a generation. Men walking away is not a fringe phenomenon. It is a rational response to long term conditions. And this brings us to a critical realization. You cannot shame people into participation. You cannot guilt them into sacrifice. You cannot demand effort without offering value. Systems that rely on moral pressure rather than mutual benefit eventually fail. Men have chosen peace over chaos, stability over approval, and reality over narrative. That choice was not dramatic, but it was decisive. And once made, it rarely reverses. We are still early in this transition, even if it feels advanced. The consequences will become clearer as economic and social pressure continue to mount. What remains to be seen is whether society adapts constructively or continues to double down on assumptions that no longer hold. This is not the end of the story, it is the midpoint. The next phase of the shift is where the consequences move from abstract discussion into lived reality. When men withdraw from roles that once absorbed pressure, that pressure does not disappear, it redistributes. Systems that were quietly supported by male participation now have to confront their own fragility. This is not about punishment or revenge, it is about physics. When weight is removed from one pillar, the structure either adjusts or collapses. One of the most misunderstood aspects of men walking away is the assumption that it is driven by hostility toward women as individuals. In most cases, it is not. It is driven by disillusionment with systems, incentives, and narratives that no longer reward good faith participation. Men did not wake up one day and decide to disengage. They arrived there through repetition. When outcomes consistently contradict effort, behavior changes. And for decades, men were encouraged to internalize responsibility without authority. They were told to be accountable for outcomes they did not control. Over time, this eroded motivation. Responsibility without agency breeds resentment, but withdrawal restores balance. By stepping away, men reclaimed our agency, even if it meant relinquishing approval. This shift is often framed as selfish, but that framing ignores context. Self preservation in an unstable environment is not selfish, it is adaptive. When participation carries asymmetric risk, opting out becomes prudent. Men recognized that many social arrangements had quietly transformed into liability traps. Distance became the safest strategy. Another critical element is how expectations evolved without negotiation. Standards increased unilaterally. Men were expected to meet emotional, financial, and behavioral criteria that expanded continuously, while their own needs were minimized or dismissed. Over time, the imbalance became obvious. Men noticed that compromise flowed in one direction. Eventually, compromise turns into depletion. What made this particularly damaging was the moral framing attached to it. Men were told that their reluctance indicated moral failure rather than rational assessment. Disagreement was framed as deficiency. This shut down dialogue. When conversation becomes accusation, withdrawal becomes inevitable. As men disengaged, many discovered that their absence did not produce the immediate collapse they were warned about. Life continued. Bills were paid. Work progressed. Peace increased. This reinforced the decision. Fear based predictions lost credibility when reality proved manageable. This realization spread quietly. Men compared notes through observation rather than ideology. They noticed similar outcomes across different backgrounds and locations. The consistency of results validated the strategy. Walking away was no longer seen as risky, but as stabilizing. Meanwhile, cultural messaging struggled to adapt. Narratives continued assuming male availability and compliance. When those assumptions failed, frustration grew. Attempts to shame men back into participation intensified. But shame is a weak motivator when alternatives exist. Men who found peace outside the system were immune to moral pressure. Economic independence played a major role. As men focused on controlling expenses and reducing obligations, financial resilience improved. Fewer liabilities meant greater flexibility. This reinforced autonomy. Men no longer needed external validation to justify their choices. They answered only to outcomes. Technology also accelerated independence. Remote work, digital services, and decentralized opportunities reduced reliance on traditional social structures. Men could design lives around efficiency rather than expectation. The gap between what was necessary and what was demanded became clear. This independence revealed something uncomfortable. Many social expectations placed on men were not necessary for societal function. They were traditions maintained by inertia. Once removed, society did not collapse immediately. Instead, it adjusted unevenly. Some sectors adapted quickly, others resisted. Resistance often took the form of moral appeals rather than structural reform. But moral appeals fail when they ignore lived experience. Men who had already stepped away were not persuaded by arguments that contradicted their improved quality of life. The dating market offers a clear example. As fewer men participated, the imbalance shifted. Expectations that relied on abundance faced resistance. When men stopped competing aggressively, negotiation dynamics changed. This produced frustration among those who assumed constant male availability. Attempts to correct this through pressure rather than introspection backfired. Men saw the same patterns repeating. The lesson was reinforced, distance was maintained. Another overlooked consequence is the impact on younger men. Observing older men disengage successfully created a blueprint. Younger men learned preemptively. They avoided costly mistakes by watching outcomes rather than trusting promises. This generational transfer accelerated disengagement. Educational environments reflected similar patterns. Boys were often framed as problems to be managed rather than individuals to be developed. This alienation carried into adulthood. Men who felt unsupported early learned to rely on themselves later. Workplace dynamics also shifted. Men became less willing to take on unpaid emotional labor or excessive responsibility without compensation. Boundaries strengthened. Efficiency replaced martyrdom. This improved individual outcomes even as it challenged organizational expectations. Critics often interpret this as disengagement from community. In reality, men often build smaller, more intentional communities. They invest in relationships that are reciprocal. Quantity decreases, quality increases. This recalibration improves trust and reduces stress. As men simplified their lives, consumption patterns changed. Status driven spending declined. Practical investments increased. This had ripple effects across markets that depended on aspirational messaging. Demand shifted toward utility rather than image. This trend also altered time horizons. Men focused on long term stability rather than short term validation. Planning replaced reacting. This strategic mindset made reversal unlikely. Once you experience control over your time and resources, surrender feels irrational. The narrative that men walking away is a protest misunderstands the psychology involved. Protest seeks attention, withdrawal seeks peace. Most men did not want recognition, they wanted relief. Silence was the solution. As the silence grows, institutions struggle to interpret it. Metrics lag behind behavior. Policies are designed for participation that no longer exists. Adjustments come slowly, friction increases. Some respond by doubling down on messaging that no longer resonates. Others experiment with incentives. Very few address root causes. Root causes require acknowledging mistakes, and acknowledgement carries social cost. The uncomfortable truth is that many men feel they were never invited into a fair negotiation. They were presented with demands framed as moral imperatives. Declining those demands required emotional resilience. Once built, that resilience supports continued disengagement. Men also learn to separate identity from approval. They no longer define themselves through external validation. This internal anchoring reduces vulnerability to manipulation. Guilt loses power when self worth is internally sourced. As economic uncertainty increases, this self reliance becomes more valuable. Men who simplified early are better positioned. They carry fewer obligations, they adapt faster, they stress less. This creates a widening gap between those who adjusted and those who did not. Frustration grows where expectations remain unmet. Calls for change intensify. But change without introspection is noise. It is important to emphasize that this shift is not ideological. Men from diverse backgrounds arrive at similar conclusions independently. The convergence suggests structural causes rather than individual pathology. Some argue that reconciliation is possible. It is, but only if conditions change materially. Rhetoric alone will not suffice. Trust must be rebuilt through consistency rather than slogans. Men will not re engage in systems that punish participation. They will not accept roles that demand sacrifice without respect. They will not ignore patterns they have already verified. The path forward requires realism. It requires acknowledging that incentives matter more than intentions. It requires designing systems that reward cooperation rather than exploit goodwill. Until then, men will continue to choose autonomy. They will continue to build quiet lives that prioritize stability. They will continue to withdraw from chaos. This is not a threat, it is a description. As pressure increases, the contrast between those who adapted and those who did not will sharpen. Some will demand solutions, others will demand accountability. The outcomes will depend on which approach dominates. Men walking away is not the end of society, it is a correction. Whether that correction leads to renewal or further fragmentation remains to be seen. What is clear is that the old assumptions no longer apply. The world has changed. Men have changed with it, and the silence continues. As this correction continues, the emotional response from broader society becomes increasingly polarized. Some respond with curiosity and a willingness to reassess long held assumptions. Others respond with anger, confusion, or denial. This divide is important because it determines whether adaptation occurs or whether pressure simply intensifies. Men are paying close attention to which path is chosen, even if they are no longer participating in the conversation publicly. One reason adaptation has been slow is that many institutions still benefit from the old narrative, at least in the short term. Admitting that incentives were misaligned would require acknowledging that certain outcomes were not accidental. It would require revisiting policies, messaging, and cultural norms that were once celebrated. That kind of reflection is uncomfortable, especially when it threatens reputations and authority. So instead, the focus often shifts to symptoms rather than causes. Men see this clearly. They recognize when accountability is redirected rather than accepted. They notice when conversations circle endlessly without producing tangible change. Each time this happens, trust erodes further. Trust, once lost, is difficult to restore, especially when the cost of reentry remains high. Another factor accelerating disengagement is the normalization of surveillance and judgment in everyday life. Men learned that privacy was shrinking and that misinterpretation carried disproportionate consequences. In such an environment, restraint becomes logical, silence becomes safety, withdrawal becomes a form of risk management. This is compounded by the fact that many men already felt socially disposable. When cultural narratives frame one group as inherently suspect, members of that group adapt by minimizing exposure. This is not unique to men, but the scale at which it occurred here is significant. When millions reach the same conclusion independently, the impact is structural. Men who walk away often describe a sense of relief rather than loss. This confounds critics who assume disengagement must be rooted in bitterness. Relief suggests that previous participation was burdensome rather than fulfilling. That realization alone is transformative. With fewer external demands, men redirect energy inward. Physical health improves as routines stabilize. Mental clarity increases as constant vigilance decreases. Financial planning becomes intentional rather than reactive. These changes compound over time, reinforcing the decision to remain disengaged. This internal stabilization also changes how men perceive risk. Once peace becomes the baseline, chaos feels intolerable. Men become more selective about where and how they engage. They ask whether interaction adds value or drains it. If the answer is unclear, they decline. This selectivity extends beyond relationships into work, media consumption, and social participation. Men curate their environments carefully. They limit exposure to narratives that provoke stress without offering solutions. This creates echo chambers of calm rather than outrage. Critics often misinterpret this as apathy. In reality, it is discernment. Men are not indifferent, they are intentional. They choose where to invest attention because attention is finite and valuable. As more men adopt this approach, cultural feedback loops weaken. Outrage loses its audience. Moral pressure loses its leverage. Systems designed to provoke reaction struggle when reaction no longer arrives. This shift also alters how men relate to time. Without constant external demands, time stretches. Days feel longer. Planning horizons extend. Men invest in skills that compound slowly rather than chasing immediate validation. Patience replaces urgency. This long term orientation is one of the most underappreciated consequences of walking away. Systems built on short term engagement struggle to compete with lifestyles optimized for endurance. Once men taste sustainability, returning to volatility feels regressive. The economic implications continue to ripple outward. Men who reduce consumption challenge growth models reliant on constant spending. Industries built on aspiration recalibrate messaging, often unsuccessfully at first. Utility becomes the new currency. This is not an ideological shift, but a practical one. Men prioritize tools over symbols, function over appearance, durability over trend. Markets eventually respond, but the transition is uneven. Social expectations adjust more slowly. Cultural narratives lag behind behavior. When behavior changes faster than stories, confusion fills the gap. People search for explanations that preserve existing beliefs. Blame becomes easier than reflection. Men recognize this pattern. They see when narratives attempt to pathologize disengagement rather than understand it. Each attempt reinforces the decision to stay silent. Dialogue requires good faith on both sides. Some observers ask whether this trend leads to isolation. The answer depends on how isolation is defined. Men walking away often maintain meaningful connections. They simply reduce exposure to unstable dynamics. Their social circles shrink but strengthen. These connections are built on shared values rather than obligation. Reciprocity replaces expectation. Trust grows because boundaries are respected. This contrasts sharply with broader social environments where boundaries are often contested. As these smaller networks stabilize, they become self reinforcing. Men see that fulfillment does not require broad approval. This realization undermines systems that rely on mass participation. The generational aspect becomes more pronounced over time. Younger men observe outcomes rather than rhetoric. They learn from the experiences of older men without repeating the same mistakes. This accelerates cultural change. Education systems feel this shift indirectly. Boys who feel disengaged from narratives that frame them negatively often disengage academically. This is not because they lack ability, but because they lack incentive. When effort does not lead to belonging, motivation declines. Workplaces face similar challenges. Men increasingly prioritize autonomy over advancement. Titles matter less than flexibility. Loyalty is transactional rather than emotional. This changes organizational culture fundamentally. Employers who adapt by offering respect, clarity, and fair exchange retain talent. Those who rely on pressure and guilt struggle. The labor market becomes a negotiation rather than a hierarchy. As autonomy increases, men also become more resilient to external shocks. Fewer dependencies mean fewer vulnerabilities. This resilience is quiet but powerful. It does not announce itself, it simply persists. This persistence challenges narratives that assume men need constant engagement to remain productive. The opposite often proves true. With fewer distractions, output becomes more focused. Quality improves, even if quantity shifts. Some critics argue that this trend undermines social cohesion. That argument assumes cohesion was healthy to begin with. Cohesion built on imbalance is fragile. Correction may reduce surface harmony but increase long term stability. Men walking away are not rejecting cooperation, they are rejecting coercion. Cooperation requires consent, consent requires fair terms. Until terms improve, disengagement remains rational. This is why attempts to shame or pressure men back into participation consistently fail. Shame loses power when individuals are content. Pressure loses effect when alternatives exist. The future will likely involve new forms of engagement that respect autonomy, smaller communities, clear boundaries, transparent expectations. These models are already emerging quietly. Those who cling to outdated assumptions may experience increasing frustration. They will interpret silence as hostility. They will misread absence as neglect. In reality, absence is simply absence. And understanding this distinction is crucial. Men are not making a statement. They are making choices, choices rooted in experience rather than ideology. As conditions continue to evolve, some men may choose to re engage selectively, others will not. Both outcomes are valid. What matters is that engagement becomes voluntary rather than assumed. This voluntary model requires humility from systems accustomed to entitlement. It requires listening rather than lecturing. It requires adaptation rather than enforcement. Whether society can make that shift remains uncertain. Change is possible, but only if reality is acknowledged honestly. Denial prolongs friction. Men will continue to watch, evaluate, and decide quietly. Their silence is not emptiness, it is observation, and the correction continues. As this observation deepens, a pattern becomes unmistakable. Men are no longer reacting emotionally to narratives that once provoked defensiveness or anger. Instead, they evaluate outcomes with a detached clarity that surprises those who still expect emotional engagement. Detachment is often mistaken for indifference, but it is more accurately described as resolution. When a conclusion has been reached internally, there is no need to argue it externally. This internal resolution changes how men interpret conflict. Disagreements no longer feel personal because identity is no longer anchored to approval. Without the need to defend a social role, criticism loses its sting. This emotional insulation is one of the strongest reinforcements of disengagement. Once built, it does not dissolve easily. Men also recognize that many debates are performative rather than productive. Arguments repeat without progress. Positions harden without reflection. In such environments, participation offers little value. Silence becomes the most efficient response. Efficiency is a core driver of male behavior, especially when resources are constrained. As silence spreads, those who relied on male engagement to sustain narratives begin to notice the void. Metrics drop, feedback loops weaken, attempts to provoke response intensify. But provocation fails when it no longer triggers reaction. Men who have stepped away do not feel compelled to correct mischaracterizations. They let outcomes speak. This reliance on outcomes rather than explanations marks a significant shift. Men are no longer trying to be understood. They are content being accurate. Accuracy does not require consensus, it requires alignment with reality. This philosophical pivot underpins the durability of the trend. Another important factor is how men redefine success. Traditional markers tied to social recognition lose relevance. Success becomes synonymous with stability, autonomy, and peace. These metrics are internal and resistant to external manipulation. Once success is self defined, external incentives lose leverage. This redefinition affects ambition. Men still pursue goals, but those goals are calibrated differently. They favor sustainable progress over visible achievement. They value competence over applause. This quiet ambition often goes unnoticed because it does not seek validation. As a result, public spaces may appear increasingly polarized or hollow. Those who thrive on engagement dominate discourse, while those who are content remain silent. This skews perception. Silence is misread as absence rather than choice. Men understand this distortion, but do not feel obligated to correct it. Correcting it would require re entering environments they deliberately exited. The cost outweighs the benefit. Peace is preserved. This preservation mindset extends to emotional labor. Men stop managing others' reactions. They stop preemptively softening truths to maintain harmony. They communicate selectively and directly within trusted circles. Outside those circles, they conserve energy. This selective communication reshapes relationships. Superficial connections fade, enduring ones strengthen. Men invest where reciprocity exists, they disengage where it does not. This pruning process creates lean but resilient social networks. The resilience of these networks becomes evident during stress. Men who simplified early adapt more easily. They rely on fewer systems and expectations. When disruptions occur, they adjust without panic. This reinforces confidence in their chosen path. As confidence grows, the temptation to re engage diminishes further. Men do not feel they are missing out, they feel they have opted out of unnecessary volatility. This perspective reframes disengagement as gain rather than loss. Cultural institutions often struggle with this reframing. They interpret disengagement as failure rather than success. They attempt to lure men back with promises that no longer resonate. Men evaluate these offers pragmatically. If terms remain unchanged, interest remains low. Trust is the central issue. Once trust is broken repeatedly, rebuilding requires sustained consistency. Sporadic gestures do not suffice. Men wait and watch rather than rushing to believe. Time becomes the proving ground. This waiting posture frustrates those accustomed to immediate compliance. They escalate rhetoric or incentives, but escalation signals desperation rather than strength. Men recognize this and remain cautious. The longer disengagement persists, the more normalized it becomes. What once seemed radical becomes routine. Social expectations adjust quietly. New norms emerge without announcement. These new norms emphasize consent over obligation. Participation becomes opt in rather than assumed. This shift challenges hierarchical structures that relied on default compliance. Negotiation replaces entitlement. Negotiation requires mutual respect. Mutual respect requires acknowledging past imbalances. This acknowledgement is difficult but necessary. Without it, negotiations stall. Men are willing to negotiate, but only when terms are clear and enforceable. Ambiguity invites exploitation. Clear boundaries prevent it. Men prioritize clarity above sentiment. This emphasis on clarity influences how men assess opportunities. Vague promises are dismissed. Concrete benefits are considered. Emotional appeals are ignored. Practical outcomes matter. As this mindset spreads, it influences younger generations. Boys learn to value discernment early. They observe consequences rather than rhetoric. This observational learning accelerates cultural change. Educational systems that fail to adapt risk losing engagement further. Boys disengage when they perceive bias or futility. Re engagement requires demonstrating fairness, not asserting it. Workplaces face similar challenges. Men respond to environments that respect contribution and boundaries. They withdraw from those that rely on pressure or guilt. Retention becomes contingent on mutual benefit, and some organizations adapt successfully. They offer autonomy, transparency, and respect. Others cling to outdated models and struggle. The divergence widens. This divergence mirrors broader societal trends. Systems that adapt survive, those that resist fracture. Men align themselves with the former and avoid the latter. Avoidance is often misinterpreted as hostility. In reality, it is optimization. Men optimize for peace, efficiency, and stability. They allocate resources accordingly. This allocation includes emotional resources. Men limit exposure to narratives that provoke stress without offering solutions. They curate information carefully. This reduces anxiety and improves focus. Focus becomes a competitive advantage. Men who disengage from noise concentrate on skill development. Skills compound over time. This compounding produces tangible benefits. As benefits accrue, confidence solidifies. Men trust their judgment because it yields results. External validation becomes unnecessary. This self trust is perhaps the most significant outcome of walking away. Once established, it is difficult to undermine. Men rely on evidence rather than opinion. This epistemic shift is durable. Attempts to reframe men's choices as pathological fail because they contradict lived experience. Men know how they feel, they know their outcomes. Labels do not change reality. Reality, once acknowledged, shapes behavior more powerfully than narrative. Men align with reality even when it is uncomfortable. This alignment guides decisions. As alignment increases, the gap between rhetoric and behavior widens. Observers notice inconsistencies, but may not understand their cause. They attribute them to attitude rather than structure. Men understand the structure, they lived it. Their withdrawal is a structural response to structural conditions. Personalizing it misses the point. The path forward depends on whether structures evolve. Evolution requires humility. It requires admitting that certain approaches failed. It requires redesigning incentives. Redesigning incentives is difficult but possible. It involves restoring reciprocity. It involves respecting boundaries. It involves valuing contribution without coercion. If such changes occur consistently, some men may choose to re engage selectively. If not, disengagement will persist. Persistence does not mean stagnation. Men continue to grow, build, and contribute in ways that align with their values. Contribution becomes voluntary rather than expected. This voluntary contribution is more sustainable. It is given freely rather than extracted. It strengthens rather than drains. Understanding this distinction is key. Extraction breeds resistance. Voluntary cooperation breeds resilience. Men have chosen resilience. They have chosen autonomy. They have chosen peace. These choices are not ideological statements. They are practical decisions shaped by experience. As experience accumulates, decisions solidify. The correction continues. And those paying attention can already see what comes next. As we reach the end of this discussion, it becomes clear that what many people are witnessing is not a crisis of motivation, but a crisis of meaning. Men did not lose the desire to contribute. They lost faith that their contribution would be respected, protected, or reciprocated. When meaning erodes, effort follows. This is not a moral judgment. It is a behavioral reality that applies across cultures and history. For a long time, participation was framed as duty rather than choice. Men were expected to shoulder responsibility regardless of conditions, consequences, or outcomes. That expectation persisted even as the environment changed. When incentives shifted and risk increased, the expectation remained. That mismatch could not hold indefinitely. Men adapted in the only way that preserved sanity and stability. They simplified. They withdrew from volatile systems. They reduced exposure to environments where effort was punished rather than rewarded. They stopped volunteering for roles that demanded sacrifice without offering security. This adaptation did not require coordination. It did not require leadership. It spread organically because the same conditions produced the same conclusions. When people independently reach similar decisions, the cause is structural rather than ideological. As men step back, they also gain perspective. Distance clarifies patterns that immersion obscures. From the outside, contradictions become obvious. Messaging that once seemed persuasive loses power when measured against outcomes. Men trusted what they could observe rather than what they were told. Observation revealed that many social pressures relied on guilt rather than fairness. Guilt works only when individuals believe they are morally obligated to comply. Once that belief dissolves, guilt loses force. Men no longer accepted responsibility for systems they did not design or benefit from. This shift did not make men hostile, it made them selective. They stopped engaging where engagement produced harm. They invested where investment produced stability. This discernment improved quality of life. Quality of life is the metric that matters most. When disengagement leads to better sleep, improved finances, stronger boundaries, and reduced stress, it reinforces itself. Arguments against disengagement struggle when they conflict with lived improvement. As this improvement becomes visible, curiosity replaces criticism for some observers. They begin to ask why disengaged men appear calmer, healthier, and more focused. The answer is simple but uncomfortable. They removed chaos from their lives. Chaos thrives in environments with unclear expectations, shifting rules, and uneven accountability. Men recognized these features and opted out. Order replaced disorder. Predictability replaced volatility. This preference for order shapes future choices. Men gravitate towards systems that offer clarity and fairness. They avoid those that rely on pressure and ambiguity. This selective engagement encourages reform where possible and abandonment where not. And abandonment is often portrayed negatively, but it can be constructive. When enough people exit a broken system, the system is forced to confront its flaws. Participation props up dysfunction, withdrawal exposes it. Exposure does not guarantee repair, but it creates the possibility. Repair requires humility and honesty. It requires acknowledging that certain approaches failed. It requires listening rather than lecturing. Whether society chooses repair remains uncertain. What is certain is that men will not return to previous roles under previous terms. The cost was too high. The lesson was too clear. Men walking away does not mean men disengaging from life. It means disengaging from imbalance. They still work, they still create, they still contribute. They simply do so where contribution makes sense. This distinction is often missed. Critics frame disengagement as abandonment of responsibility. In reality, it is a refusal to subsidize dysfunction. Responsibility remains, but it is directed inward rather than outward. And directed inward, responsibility produces growth. Men invest in health, skill, and stability. These investments compound. Over time, they produce independence. Independence changes negotiation dynamics. Men no longer bargain from scarcity, they choose from abundance. This reduces vulnerability to manipulation. Manipulation relies on need. When need decreases, manipulation fails. Men who reduce needs early are insulated. They observe without reacting. Reaction once fueled cycles of conflict. Non reaction dissolves them. Without fuel, fire burns out. This does not mean conflict disappears. It means men no longer feed it. Energy is conserved for constructive pursuits. Constructive pursuits often occur quietly. They do not announce themselves. They produce results rather than attention. Attention seeking systems struggle to compete with result oriented lifestyles. Noise loses appeal. Substance gains value. As substance becomes the standard, superficial narratives lose influence. Reality asserts itself slowly but firmly. This process is uneven and uncomfortable. Transitions always are. Those invested in the old order resist. Those benefiting from the new order remain silent. Silence should not be mistaken for apathy. It is confidence. Confidence built on evidence does not need validation. Men trust their decisions because those decisions improve their lives. Improvement is the ultimate argument. It does not shout, it persists. As time passes, the outcomes of disengagement become harder to deny. Patterns repeat, predictions prove accurate, credibility shifts. Those who adapt gain ground, those who refuse lose relevance. This is not about winning, it is about alignment. And alignment with reality produces stability. Stability produces peace. Peace becomes the goal. Men chose peace. That choice was rational, it was earned, it was reinforced by experience, and it will not be undone by rhetoric. As we conclude this conversation, the most important takeaway is this: men did not leave because they hated society. They left because they stopped recognizing themselves in it. When identity is erased or distorted, participation loses meaning. Restoring meaning requires respect, reciprocity, and realism. Without those, disengagement remains the default. The future will belong to those who understand this and adapt accordingly. Others will continue arguing with outcomes. Men will continue watching. They will continue choosing carefully. They will continue building quietly. And when they do engage, it will be because the terms make sense. Not because they were pressured, not because they were shamed, but because cooperation finally became mutual again. If you have listened this far, ask yourself what you think about what was discussed. Do you agree? Do you see these patterns around you? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. These conversations matter when they are honest. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.